A maid working for a wealthy family noticed something peculiar and decided to install cameras in the house. What she discovered left her frozen with shock. Another day began in Maria's monotonous life. A modest, middle-aged woman, she had been serving one of the most influential and wealthy families in the city for years. From a young age, Maria had known severe poverty, becoming an orphan early on. She spent part of her childhood in a religious orphanage where she received basic shelter and education in return for doing various chores, until she finally became self-reliant. With few opportunities due to her limited education, Maria had taken on all kinds of arduous jobs to make ends meet, washing clothes for others, cooking in diners, cleaning offices and houses. Until an old employer recommended her for a position in the luxurious mansion of the esteemed Nunez family, who were looking for a reliable maid. The interview and tests she underwent were quite rigorous, scrutinizing the tiniest details of her past before offering her the job. But after that exhaustive background check, Maria finally secured the coveted position. From that moment, her life improved considerably, although her status remained very modest and inferior compared to the always demanding Nunez family. They assigned her a small service room next to the kitchen and laundry room where she could sleep without having to pay rent. Though the cleaning and maintenance work was grueling from dawn to dusk, for the first time in her life, Maria had a fixed salary and a roof over her head, ensuring at least some stability. On this particular day, Maria hurried more than usual as her boss demanded breakfast to be ready and the family awake before 7 a.m. because Mr. Nunez had to leave for a very important meeting at the headquarters of his shipping company. No one in their right mind would dare to slightly defy the strict orders of the always intimidating Rodolfo Nunez. At 58, Mr. Nunez had inherited a thriving maritime business from his father, which under his stern command had expanded to entire fleets of ships and warehouses, not only in the country, but also abroad. Today he would sign a lucrative contract to establish new trade routes with Asian partners, which would further increase his already enormous fortune. Maria had always felt uneasy and even a bit afraid of this tall man with eyes as cold as steel, who rarely exchanged words with her beyond a dry good morning or an occasional order. Every morning, without fail, she meticulously checked every corner to ensure the floors shone, and every piece of furniture was perfectly cleaned before serving the abundant breakfast to her employers. While carefully cleaning the large window of the living room facing the street, Maria glanced for a moment towards the spacious dining room where the entire Nunez family was already gathered, once again in a dense silence only interrupted by the light clinking of fine porcelain. At the head of the table was the always stern Mr. Rodolfo, clean-shaven and dressed in one of his elegant tailored suits, reading the stock quotes of the day while sipping his coffee. Beside him, Mrs. Elvira barely touched her breakfast, elegantly spreading raspberry jam on her toast. At 50, Mrs. Nunez maintained a slender and youthful figure, enhanced by wearing fine designer clothes and jewelry that denoted the family's enormous wealth. As a typical high society wife, Elvira spent most of her days organizing charity events and playing poker and bridge with her friends, always aiming to appear in the social chronicles as the perfect lady of the house, fulfilling her decorative role. Finally, at the other end of the large table was the family's only son, Gerardo. The 14-year-old would one day inherit the entire maritime empire, so he was being raised almost forcefully by his father in business, being made to attend meetings and familiarize himself with the company's matters from a very young age. Maria had always noticed how different Gerardo was from both his father and his mother. He hardly spoke during meals, keeping his head down most of the time, only timidly raising his eyes from his plate when his father addressed him with a question or comment about the business. She also noticed how extremely pale and haggard he looked lately, as if something were worrying him or he were falling ill. But Maria knew it wasn't her place to meddle in her employer's family matters. That day, Gerardo looked even more gaunt than usual, barely touching his food with a rather disheveled appearance, as if he had seen a ghost. Suddenly, his eyes met Maria's for a fraction of a second, and she felt a terrible chill. The boy's gaze was one of such deep anguish and desperation that she almost dropped the window cleaner she was holding. At that moment, Mr. Nunez stood up so abruptly that his chair almost fell backward, startling everyone. "Well, there's no more time to lose. Gerardo, you'll stay studying the reports I left on your desk last night. I expect you to have thoroughly analyzed the projections for the acquisitions in Singapore when I return. Have a good day, my dear," he said coldly to his wife, then planted a dry kiss on her forehead, almost without looking at her. After grabbing his briefcase and car keys, without even waiting for a response, the imposing businessman walked firmly through the hallway towards the underground garage to head to his company, as he did every morning. The brief and uncomfortable moment was interrupted by the sound of Gerardo's phone vibrating noisily on the table under his mother's reproachful gaze. The young man took it nervously and excused himself, quickly retreating to his room, leaving his breakfast almost untouched. Elvira sighed resignedly and also stood up, not without first swatting away a fly that hovered around the remains of jam on her plate with the tablecloth. She hated those insects. She called Maria with a slight gesture of her jeweled hand to give her instructions for the day, with her characteristic curt and weary tone. "Maria, I need you to vacuum all the carpets and wash the curtains in the main hall. With the heat, they get filled with disgusting mosquitoes. Oh, and don't forget to water the plants in the back garden. The gardener only comes twice a week, and that scorching sun burns them. I'll be in my room handling some matters by phone. Please prepare a fresh salad for lunch. With this heat, I don't want anything heavy." Having delivered her brief monologue, Mrs. Nunez left the dining room for her quarters without even waiting for a response from the maid. Maria was more than accustomed to these curt and impersonal manners. That had been the way throughout all the years she had served in the mansion. Without further ado, she diligently set out to fulfill her mistress's tasks with energy and meticulousness. If there was one thing that characterized Maria, it was her extreme dedication and responsibility in her duties, no matter how tedious or repetitive they might become after so much time. Her work was her greatest pride. Once she had finished the thorough cleaning of the main hall, including the carpets, she hurried to the back patio to water the plants as requested. She always strove to be efficient, to avoid any kind of reprimand, very aware of how lucky she was to have stable employment and housing at her age. She couldn't afford to risk that hard-earned privilege. As she sprayed abundant fresh water over the rose leaves using a pretty tin watering can she liked so much, Maria suddenly noticed out of the corner of her eye that the back door of the kitchen leading to the patio was inexplicably ajar. She was completely sure she hadn't left it like that when she went out moments before. In fact, she distinctly remembered hearing the typical metallic click of the lock as it closed, as it did every morning. Puzzled by this unusual occurrence, she approached cautiously, holding the watering can as a weapon in case there was an intruder on the property. She knew she had to be extremely careful. Could it be a thief? Impossible. The mansion had state-of-the-art security systems. With her heart nearly pounding out of her chest, Maria fully opened the heavy door, which creaked slightly on its hinges. She held her breath, anticipating the worst. But to her great surprise, when she quickly glanced inside, she saw absolutely no one. The utensils and pots were hanging intact on the wall in their usual place. There was no sign that anyone had rummaged through the drawers or the pantry. Everything seemed normal. After thoroughly checking every corner without finding anything out of the ordinary that would explain the mysteriously open door, Maria resecured it, feeling somewhat confused. Perhaps, she thought, the breeze had gently pushed the door open. Or maybe she was simply so fatigued from the endless list of tasks that her memory was playing tricks on her. In any case, she tried to dismiss it and focused on finishing the rest of her chores. After completing the most demanding cleaning tasks and preparing the light lunch for her employer as instructed, Maria headed to the laundry room to continue the maintenance cycle of the elegant living room curtains. It was a rather tedious task, but one she couldn't postpone much longer. As she carefully placed the long ivory silk fabric into the large soaking tub and began pouring the necessary neutral detergent, her eyes suddenly noticed something that made her hold her breath. There, in one of the corners of the large sink, were some tiny spots that looked like blood. Astonished, she closely examined the fabric, trying to find a rational explanation. Those almost imperceptible crimson specks stood out vividly against the soft ivory background. Where could they have come from? She gently ran her fingers over the spots, which also turned a deep red. It was definitely blood. But whose? And how did it get there? She immediately dismissed the possibility that it was her own blood. She clearly remembered not having injured herself in recent days. It also seemed unlikely that a visitor or family member had been injured in the main living room to explain these strange stains on the curtains. So, where on earth had the blood come from? And what was it doing there, as if someone had tried to hide it among the folds of the fabric? A deep chill ran down her spine as the growing confusion and alarming sensation that something very strange was happening in this house, without her knowledge. Suddenly, she remembered the enigmatic look of deep terror and pain in Gerardo's eyes during breakfast. She also recalled the incident with the slightly open door hours earlier near the same laundry room. Her pulse quickened, sensing something sinister lurking behind the seemingly innocuous and opulent facade where she had worked for years. At that moment, some sudden approaching footsteps startled her just as she was about to photograph the disturbing stains as proof that she wasn't imagining things. She quickly dropped the curtain back into the sink and resumed her task, whistling nonchalantly when the housekeeper appeared looking for some clean sheets. After the stout woman left with the pile of white sheets in her arms, Maria hesitated for a moment about whether to tell her about her discovery, but decided against it. There was no sense in worrying others over something that could well be a mistake on her part. She decided to wait before drawing any hasty conclusions, but deep down she knew she had to stay alert. Too many unusual things had happened in that house that day, and her instinct told her something very suspicious was hidden behind the impeccable facade of the Núñez family. That night, she struggled to fall asleep in her small service room, tormented by possible explanations for what had happened that morning. She considered informing Mr. or Mrs. Núñez, or perhaps going straight to the police. No, she had no proof, and they might think she was crazy. And if she was simply imagining everything due to fatigue or stress, it didn't make sense to worry her employers without solid reasons. But her heart told her there was something very wrong. If only she could confirm that her suspicions were real and not just paranoia, she would feel much more at ease the next morning. Maria woke up after a long night of restless and interrupted sleep, still burdened by the strange incidents of the previous day, replaying over and over in her mind. But she tried to momentarily set aside those worries and began her routine with renewed energy. After dressing quickly and tidying up her small room for the next few hours, she diligently headed to the kitchen to prepare the lavish breakfast for her employers, as she did every morning. On the way, she almost bumped into Gerardo, who also seemed to have had a terrible night, given how haggard he looked, with dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning, Gerardo," she greeted him kindly. But the boy didn't respond, continuing on his way with his head down and dragging his feet. Maria couldn't help but notice he was wearing the same clothes as the previous day, as if he hadn't even gone to bed all night. Once in the kitchen, while frying some bacon and making freshly squeezed orange juice, her thoughts returned to solving the mystery of those strange stains. She needed to confirm as soon as possible whether they were real or just a product of her imagination. An idea began to form in her mind as she served breakfast at the table. She would take advantage of having to return to the laundry room for the drying cycle of those curtains to examine them closely once more and settle her doubts once and for all. Minutes later, when the employers left the table to head to their respective obligations under Maria's watchful eye, she hurriedly went back to the laundry room. With her heart racing, she opened the dryer before the cycle finished to anxiously pull out the long silk curtains. She spread them out on a table, examining them inch by inch for the red stains. And there they were, so clear and evident that she felt a terrible chill run through her body, making the hairs on her neck stand up. They weren't her imagination. Someone had tried to remove that blood stain, but some drops had impregnated the fabric. She had to get to the bottom of this mystery as soon as possible. Determined to find clues that would allow her to elucidate where the suspicious substance had come from, she took some drops with a swab, soaking it well, and then storing it in a transparent bag she always carried in her apron in case she needed to collect samples. She discreetly labeled it as textile substance N1 and hid it among her belongings for later analysis. With her heart still racing, she resumed her usual work, vigorously scrubbing the stain to remove any trace from the curtain. She had to do it before anyone else saw it, or her job would be in grave danger. If they discovered her snooping into matters that didn't concern her, they could even accuse her of theft. She had to be extremely careful from now on, but she was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery no matter what. In the following days, Maria continued with her usual work, but observing every little detail around her like a hawk, as anything out of place could constitute a new clue about what was happening in that house. But she detected nothing relevant in the first few days beyond the usual aloofness and cold relationships among the Núñez family. Gerardo still looked sickly and barely ate during meals, lost in his own world. Both the family members and the rest of the staff showed no signs of being worried or alert to anything strange happening under their noses. It wasn't until the 5th day of intense covert surveillance that Maria experienced the second disturbing incident. While sweeping some dry leaves on the back terrace, she heard a faint, almost imperceptible moan coming from the backyard, specifically from the property. Trying to find the source of the sound, to her surprise, the moan repeated, this time a bit louder but still weak and muffled. It was clearly coming from the dilapidated structure currently used by the gardener as a storage for his tools and bags of soil or fertilizer. What or who could be making those sounds? Maria began to fear the worst. Gathering her courage and feeling the ground, she whispered in a slightly trembling voice, "Is anyone there? Please answer me. Don't be afraid. I'm here to help." Only silence responded. After a few tense seconds that felt like an eternity, waiting expectantly for any sign of life, she began to circle the shed, looking for a way to peer inside. It was then that she noticed a small side window almost concealed by the undergrowth. She had to stand on tiptoe to look in. She first timidly peeked one eye, trying to adjust her vision to the darkness. When she could make out what was on the dirty floor, she couldn't stifle a gasp of horror, quickly covering her mouth with both hands. There, curled up in a ball, lay a small figure she instantly recognized. It was Gerardo. Maria had to summon all her determination not to run away in panic and seek help. She forced herself to look again to make sure it wasn't an illusion, but there was no doubt. That blonde, somewhat tangled hair and clothing were unmistakable. Young Nunez was clearly in trouble, tied up hand and foot, gagged, and barely making muffled sounds of suffering. But what the hell was going on there? Without thinking twice, she circled the small structure, looking for a way to get in and help the boy. Finally, she found a door secured only with a worn padlock, which she managed to force open with the gardener's pliers. Holding her breath, she entered, ready to face any danger to save Gerardo. But to her immense surprise, there was absolutely no one there but the weakened young man, still bound on the cold cement floor with traces of having cried, perhaps due to panic and pain. Without saying a word, Maria quickly cut the ties binding his hands and feet with scissors, removing the gag from his mouth. My God! Young Gerardo, are you all right? What did they do to you, for heaven's sake? She asked, anguished, while helping him to sit up and trying to get him to respond by patting his cheeks. The stunned boy still seemed to be in shock, trembling like a leaf in the wind. Suddenly his gaze focused on Maria's face and his eyes filled with tears. He threw himself at her, sobbing uncontrollably, trying to explain. Oh, Maria, thank you for finding me. I thought I was going to die here. It was them again, my parents. I don't know why they hate me so much. Maria felt anger take over her entire being upon hearing this, but she forced herself to remain calm for the poor boy's sake, who was now releasing all his accumulated suffering onto her. She tried to comfort him as best she could, drying his tears and whispering words of reassurance in his ear during that tight embrace. After letting him cry for several minutes to relieve tension, she helped him to his room, almost dragging him, making sure no one saw them so he could clean up and change after such a traumatic experience. She served him sweet tea and some cookies, instructing him to stay and rest, while she went to get some painkillers for his reddened wrists. The panic and confusion in the young man's eyes were evident. Before quickly leaving for the medication, Maria tried to find out more about what had happened. Young Gerardo, I know it's very soon and maybe you don't want to talk about it, but I need to know exactly what happened to help you. Who locked you up and hurt you so cruelly? Was it your parents, as you said? Please, I am your friend and would never betray you. Tell me the truth. Gerardo shuddered, as if he had received a strong electric shock. After a moment of hesitation, he broke down, crying again. It was my father. Last night he caught me trying to sneak out of the house, and as punishment, he locked me up all day without food or water, and he beat me very hard, Maria. I thought he was going to kill me. Please, you have to get me out of here. This is hell. Maria's heart ached at that heartbreaking plea. She stroked his hair maternally, promising she would help him escape, no matter what. She kissed his forehead before leaving to get those pills, discreetly wiping away her own tears of helplessness as she walked down the hallway. How could parents be so cruel and heartless to their own child? She had no more doubts. Something truly sinister was happening behind those elegant walls, and she swore she would get to the bottom of it to save the poor boy from the clutches of those heartless monsters before it was too late. This time, nothing and no one would change her mind. That night, after making sure Gerardo was sound asleep under the effect of a mild sedative, Maria quietly headed to the seldom-visited attic just above the private wing where the Nunez's quarters were located. According to her watch, it was about 2 a.m, the time when deep sleep overcomes even the most awake. She carefully avoided making any noise that might wake someone and proceeded to place the small device she had obtained. a tiny spy camera with sound and night vision sensors, which an acquaintance had gotten for her at a modest price. She secured it with adhesive tape in a dark corner behind a beam so it would go unnoticed, but still capture the entrance to the master bedroom. She typed a few commands into the portable modem, linking it to the camera to activate the continuous recording function. If something suspicious was happening, she would now capture it with solid evidence. She could monitor the Nunez's movements from a distance, thanks to the app on her phone. She was determined to protect Gerardo as if he were her son, no matter the danger to herself. She would show those arrogant rich folks what a humble maid was capable of doing for love. Over the next few days, Maria fervently dedicated herself to her undercover mission, without neglecting any of her usual household chores to avoid arousing suspicion. She continued to impeccably fulfill all her duties, even with her heart in her throat and her mind focused on analyzing the audiovisual material discreetly captured by the hidden attic camera. She spent every free minute she had watching the screen of her phone, mentally noting everything that happened in front of the Nunez's main bedroom. As a precaution, she had also installed an app to directly record the images to the cloud in case something happened to her phone. During the first 48 hours, the footage was mundane and boring. It only showed brief scenes of the housekeeper cleaning, a maid removing sheets to wash, or Mrs. Elvira coming and going elegantly dressed, probably for her social engagements and card games with friends. Nothing relevant. It was not until the afternoon of the third day that Maria witnessed the first disturbing scene. After Elvira returned from having tea with her lady companion and lay down for a while browsing her phone, her husband suddenly burst in, his face twisted in fury, slamming the door open. "Damn it, Elvira. Where the hell did you put the documents I clearly told you to file about the shipyard acquisition? I almost lost a multi-million-dollar deal today in front of the board because of your incompetence," he raged, throwing a nearby floor lamp as he entered. The woman startled up from the bed, evidently accustomed to these angry outbursts. She responded somewhat intimidated, but without losing her composure, pointing towards the dressing room where important papers were kept in a built-in safe. She seemed very familiar with this aggressive behavior. Quickly, she typed some numbers into the digital panel to open the small vault and handed him a slightly yellowed envelope with the logo of some maritime company. Without a word or thanks, the enraged businessman snatched it violently from her hands to glance through it briefly. He held his breath until confirming they were the missing documents, and without another word, stormed out like an enraged beast, muttering insults under his breath but not hitting her, to Maria's relief as she anticipated this outcome. "Damned animal," thought the maid, clenching her fists in impotence. It was obvious that the household staff was so familiar with these incidents of violence that they didn't even flinch at the sounds of shouts and insults. Otherwise, they would have already quit in horror at such indignity. Perhaps out of fear or pity, they didn't report the abuse, but she had no intention of standing by idly. At that moment, Gerardo timidly entered his mother's room, calling her. The boy walked slightly hunched over with a black eye and a quite emaciated appearance after the terrible beating his father had given him days ago. Seeing him in such a deplorable state broke Maria's heart into 1,000 pieces. The poor thing was just a confused teenager who didn't deserve any of that torment. "Mom, can we talk for a moment?" he asked in a broken voice, hesitantly entering the opulent bedroom. Elvira didn't even turn to look at him as she disdainfully replied while touching up her makeup in the large mirror. "Not now, Gerardo. I'm getting ready to go out. Tell the maid to help you with whatever you need and leave me alone," she replied without a shred of warmth, dismissing him. Maria felt so much rage and helplessness at that moment that she almost threw her phone violently against the wall, if not for the fact that it continued recording impassively. How was it possible that this woman didn't rush to comfort and protect her own son, seeing him so defenseless and injured? Instead, she seemed annoyed by his presence, as if he were a nuisance. The Nunez family were definitely soulless beasts, and her moral duty was to confront them to save Gerardo from that ordeal. But she needed more solid evidence first. In the following days, the maid gathered more evidence of Don Rodolfo's violent character, like the day he threw a glass of brandy, setting the living room curtains on fire because of an out-of-place comment by the butler. Gerardo and his mother also appeared sporadically on camera, arguing until she slapped him hard, making him run crying inconsolably to his room. Maria boiled with rage at every new outrage she witnessed in those videos, but she held back, thinking about her escape plan for the boy. She had some savings and a distant friend who owed her a big favor. Maybe she could turn to him to hide the boy for a while until she decided what to do. But she couldn't act hastily, or they would be discovered. On the 7th day of surveillance, Maria witnessed the most dramatic scene yet. In the early hours of the morning, the attic camera captured movement in the main hallway leading to the master bedroom. To her horror, she saw a very agitated Don Rodolfo practically dragging a terrified Gerardo by the hair while shouting all sorts of insults. The crazed man slammed the door open and then brutally shoved the teenager onto the bed. He then pulled a gleaming hunting knife from his pocket, a sight that would be etched in Maria's mind for the rest of her life. Without saying a word, he pounced on the defenseless boy, aiming the knife straight at his neck. What happened next was so fast that she almost fainted right there. In a matter of seconds, Don Rodolfo immobilized his son, cutting his shirt open mercilessly with the knife, while a terrified Gerardo screamed in pain, crying and begging him to stop. But the crazed man was out of control, slashing his chest and arms while growling like a wild animal. Blood flowed abundantly, staining the sheets. Maria was paralyzed with horror at this gruesome scene, reminiscent of a horror movie. Tears fell uncontrollably down her cheeks as she listened to her young friend's screams and pleas. She internally prayed that someone would rescue him from that ordeal, unable to even move due to the tremendous emotional shock. Suddenly, the door burst open and a hysterical Elvira stormed into the room upon hearing the heartbreaking screams. Seeing the macabre scene, she screamed crazily for her husband to stop immediately. She even had to wrestle with the crazed man to take the bloody knife from his hands before he ended up killing the boy in that psychotic rage. After one last furious shove that threw his son against a mirror, shattering it, a panting Don Rodolfo calmed down a bit, snorting like an enraged bull. Without saying a word, he only cast a contemptuous glance at Gerardo, who lay curled up, sobbing in a corner, and left, slamming the door while his wife screamed angrily. The poor teenager had his torso, arms, and face bloodied from the cuts, although fortunately the wounds seemed relatively superficial. Maria turned off the screen when she saw the housekeeper come in to help him. She couldn't continue recording. Trembling from head to toe, she had to sit down before she vomited from the shock of witnessing such an atrocity live. She knew Mr. Nunez was a violent and ruthless man, but she never imagined he would go so far as to try to kill Gerardo, his own son. That night she stayed up, feeling terribly guilty for not having done anything to prevent that savage attack. The images of her young friend covered in blood haunted her mind, causing terrible anguish. She should have intervened somehow. Tomorrow, without fail, she would find a way to get him out of that terrifying house secretly. Early in the morning, she hurried to Gerardo's quarters, pretending to bring a breakfast tray as an excuse to check that he had indeed been treated and to verify his mood. To her relief, the young man was already clean, with his wounds treated and somewhat more recovered after the nightmare he had lived through. They both cried, hugging for a long time, releasing all the accumulated anguish and fear. Gerardo sincerely thanked her for being the only person who truly cared about him. That day, Maria solemnly promised him that she would get him out of there as soon as possible, no matter what. She would take him far away, where his cruel parents could never hurt him again. He tried to persuade her, saying it was very dangerous, and he didn't want her to be harmed. But her determination was unwavering. In the following days, the exasperated staff had to endure the continuous screams and insults of the irate Mr. Nunez against anyone who crossed his path, venting all his frustration and anger for any trifle, without anyone being able to defend themselves or contradict him. Maria increased her vigilance and evidence collection, knowing that it was only a matter of time before he tried to kill Gerardo or another staff member in one of his uncontrolled fits of rage. Meanwhile, she secretly strengthened her ties with her friend, Camilo, a truck driver, who owed her his life after she took care of him years ago when he suffered a serious accident from which he miraculously recovered. He was the ideal candidate to smuggle Gerardo out of the city without anyone suspecting, taking him to a distant relative in another state, where he could study under a new identity that she would create herself. One afternoon, the routine was interrupted when Maria was unexpectedly called to Don Rodolfo's office. Nervous, she immediately went, fearing he had discovered something about her escape plan. She knocked lightly on the door, and the man coldly told her to enter. As she opened it, the imposing man was standing by the window with his back to her, speaking on the phone in a threatening tone to someone. Seeing her enter, he abruptly ended the call. "Sir, please tell me how I can help you," Maria muttered, somewhat intimidated. The man took his time before turning to look at her with that cold stare that sent chills down her spine, as if deciding exactly what words to use. "Maria, I will be absolutely clear in my next instructions, and I hope this stays between us, right? For your sake, it better be," he inquired in a tone that didn't bode well. The woman could only nod slightly, already expecting the worst. What Don Rodolfo said next left her frozen, confirming that Gerardo was in even greater danger than she imagined. Her mission to save him had now become urgent and literally a matter of life and death. "Starting tomorrow, I need you to bring Gerardo's breakfast to his room first thing in the morning and personally handle all his meals straight from the kitchen. I will ensure that no one else has contact with him alone, including you. If he asks you anything, just say, 'These are my orders to take care of his health,' nothing more. Am I clear?" Maria closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the terrifying implications behind that strange request. It was very clear. They intended to keep Gerardo isolated, possibly drugged, or locked up for something sinister that was about to happen soon. Mr. Nunez wanted to have absolute control over him, preventing any attempt to escape or call for help. Everything fit. They were about to commit some atrocity against the poor teenager, perhaps even eliminate him. With the greatest composure she could muster, Maria fervently committed to obeying that order to the letter. She even offered to alter the boy's medication by adding some extra sedatives for his well-being. Mr. Nunez smiled, pleased with her initiative, trusting the loyalty of someone he considered just a servant. She would take advantage of this false confidence for her own benefit. "Very well, Maria. I see you are a cautious and intelligent woman. You know how to take care of this respectable family's interests. I suppose, given your years here, you know well what could happen to those who betray us, right? I trust your sagacity, he added, as a subtle threat in case she thought of deserting. Don't worry, sir. I only wish to protect you, especially young Gerardo. Nothing bad will happen to him now that I'm on alert, she affirmed confidently. That's what I like to hear. You may go now. I'll call you if I need anything else, he concluded, satisfied with his subordinate's performance. Maria knew she had too much to lose if she dared to play dirty, or at least that's what he thought. After leaving that chilling meeting with Mr. Nunez, Maria wasted no time. She knew she had only a few days before they carried out some sinister plan against Gerardo, now that they had decided to keep him isolated, possibly drugging him to have him at their mercy. Time was running out to get him out of there. She couldn't make any mistakes. As soon as she had the chance, she snuck into the garage to make a private call to her friend Camilo, asking him to meet urgently that same afternoon at a downtown cafe. She needed to inform him of the dangerous escape plan and enlist his help to transport the boy to a safe place outside the city as soon as possible. He agreed, worried after noticing her altered tone, canceling previous commitments to meet her as soon as possible. A few hours later, at a table somewhat secluded in the modest establishment where she knew no one from the residential neighborhood would recognize her, Maria proceeded to inform her dear friend of the delicate situation. She revealed, without giving too many details, the hell that Gerardo was living in, and the founded fear that his parents were planning to get rid of him in a sinister way, taking advantage of his isolation from the rest of the household. As she had imagined, the good Camilo fervently agreed to help them. They had been like siblings long ago, and he felt immense gratitude to Maria for taking care of him after the accident where he lost a leg, providing moral and financial support. Now, he had a prosperous transport business with several trucks. He could provide one and even accompany them part of the way to the border without arousing suspicion, as it was common in his line of work. After finalizing the details of the elaborate plan, they agreed to stay in touch to act as soon as Maria considered there was imminent danger to get the boy out of the house. Camilo assured her he had a safe escape route ready to a cousin's cabin in the mountains, where they could hide for a reasonable time far from everything. He just awaited her signal to depart. The next 2 days were agonizing for the poor maid, who had to pretend absolute normalcy before the staff, while inside she was boiling with anguish and anxiety. She even had to coordinate with the housekeeper to personally take the food trays to Gerardo's room 3 times a day, ensuring she wasn't followed or observed by anyone else according to the strict imposed rules. She took advantage of those brief moments alone with the boy to try to keep him calm and positive, though deep down she feared they were drugging him as he seemed much more apathetic and decayed since that unusual isolation. The poor boy couldn't sleep, plagued by fear and anxiety about what his deranged parents might be plotting to do to him. He begged Maria repeatedly, between sobs, not to leave him alone there, clinging to her for comfort and protection. Seeing him so dejected and desperate broke the poor woman's heart, reaffirming her firm determination to risk everything to get him out of that hell, no matter the cost. She had gathered her meager savings and some clothes under the pretense of donating them for when the time came to embark on the escape. Her handbag now always carried a small syringe with a potent sedative, in case she needed to use it on Gerardo to facilitate his escape without struggle. She prayed she wouldn't have to resort to it, but it was better to be prepared. On the morning of the 4th day after Mr. Nunez's sinister orders to keep his son isolated, Maria received the call she had been waiting for, but also feared with every fiber of her being. Her accomplice Camilo was ready on the agreed route, awaiting the signal to go and rescue him when she deemed it was the critical time to act. After a brief, coded conversation where they agreed on some logistical details, The maid ended the call with a racing heart. The moment had come to risk everything without margin for error. She had to figure out a way to get Gerardo out that very night, if possible, or by the next day at the latest. She prayed to have enough cunning and cold blood for her elaborate escape plan to work. In her hands rested the life of the poor boy. The rest of the day seemed eternal amidst the regular household chores and her furtive visits to check on the boy, who by then was delirious from some potent drug or medication they were secretly giving him to keep him in an almost catatonic state. Seeing him so pale and confused tore her heart apart, redoubling her urgency to get him out of danger as soon as possible. It was near midnight when Maria finally gathered the courage to sneak quietly once more to the semi-conscious Gerardo's room. She was sweating cold, but strangely felt more determined and brave than ever in her life. Silently, she prayed for help from all the saints and heavenly forces as she crossed the dark corridor separating her from the confused boy's bedroom, who was half asleep on his bed. Holding her breath and trying to control her frantic heartbeat, she proceeded to inject the potent drug into his arm as she had mentally practiced over and over. Within seconds, the sedative took effect, plunging the boy into a deep sleep from which he wouldn't wake for several hours, long enough to get him out of there and gain an advantage before the inevitable uproar. After ensuring Gerardo was completely knocked out and immobile, she passed one of his thin arms over her neck and, firmly holding him by the waist, she lifted him laboriously to carry him, almost dragging down the solitary corridor. Although small and somewhat aged, the adrenaline in the face of the danger of being discovered multiplied her physical strength. The journey to the back service exit felt endless, filled with huffs and stumbles as she carried the dead weight of the unconscious teenager as best she could. Several times, Gerardo nearly collapsed if not for the iron will of his heroic savior. "Just a little more, my boy. We're almost out of this horrible place." "Hold on, please," she thought, slowly advancing through the interminable hallway. After what seemed like a torturous eternity carrying the youngest Núñez, Maria finally reached the escape route to the street through the back service exit, trying not to be captured by the surveillance cameras. To her immense relief, she quickly spotted her friend Camilo's truck, parked a few blocks away at the agreed spot, with the lights off to avoid drawing attention. With her chest about to burst from the strenuous walk, the determined woman stumbled toward the vehicle, but did not stop, knowing every second counted. In what felt like an eternity, she managed to get onto the cargo platform with the sleeping young man, helped by her loyal accomplice, who was waiting expectantly and alert. Without a word, and immediately setting into motion, Camilo drove swiftly but carefully, avoiding detection by the night patrols. As they quickly disappeared into the lonely streets heading toward the highway, an exhausted but immensely relieved Gerardo dozed on Maria's lap, who continued to gently stroke his forehead, still unable to believe they had managed to get him out safe and sound. Tears of emotion streamed down her cheeks. Half an hour later, they were traveling without incident along the route to the mountains, leaving behind the city where terror and oppression reigned. They had passed the hardest part. But Maria was aware that the nightmare was not yet over. They needed to reach the promised hideout as soon as possible and maintain a low profile there for an indefinite period until the situation cooled down enough to arrange a definitive change of residence and name for the boy so he could rebuild his life peacefully, far from the clutches of his evil parents. It was only at dawn that a groggy Gerardo woke up confused, feeling transported, not quite understanding where he was. He looked around, disoriented, until his eyes met those of a smiling and very proud Maria. Instantly, the memories flooded back, and unable to avoid it, he broke down in tears, realizing what this brave woman had dared to do for him. "Don't cry, my boy. You're safe now. Those evil people will never hurt you again. I promise," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion as she wrapped him in a protective and maternal hug. Every second of anguish and anxiety had been worth it to finally see that sweet boy, whom she adored so much, safe after witnessing silently every abuse he suffered helplessly in that grim place. Once discreetly settled in a humble shelter located in the mountains, owned by a distant relative of Camilo who offered them shelter and food for a few days, the small group finally relaxed a bit from the tension of the escape, enjoying something as simple yet sublime as a hot cup of chocolate by the rustic fireplace. As she watched the flames illuminate Gerardo's sweet face, who slept exhausted but peacefully on her lap after so many torments, Maria knew deep in her soul that every second of anxious waiting had been worth it to finally see that pure and innocent angel in peace. She would cherish until her last days the image of that defenseless child whom fate had placed in her path to provide him with her maternal support and protection in the most critical and dark moments. The next 2 days were paradoxically tense, but also like a kind of honeymoon for the small group in that rustic lodge hidden among the remote mountains. Camilo had to leave occasionally to try to get information on the reaction to the escape of the Núñez heir and whether the police were on their trail. Meanwhile, Maria and Gerardo voluntarily remained without news from the outside. They devoted themselves to long talks and walks through the picturesque surroundings, where the young man could finally breathe an air of freedom after a life of being chained and humiliated, like a wild animal destined for slaughter. With each word, each hug, each meaningful glance, both felt their souls share an indestructible bond, like a family beyond any blood ties. Fate had crossed their paths at that crucial moment to give each other the strength and wisdom needed to overcome every challenge, no matter how overwhelming. This chemistry, sustained by the most genuine trust and the most absolute, unconditional love, was growing stronger in both their hearts to the point where it seemed like they had spent a lifetime together, not just a few years, where until then the distance between employees and employers had insisted on separating them. It was a warm night, after a long conversation as confidants, where each bared their deepest fears to the other, that the ever-present spark of attraction that silently lay between them ignited a flame that no autumn could extinguish. And what began as an innocent goodnight kiss would seal the beginning of a love affair as pure as it was overwhelming. Between shy blushes and nervous laughter, given the situation, they both decided from that very moment to surrender to the emerging feeling. They deliberately chose to set aside any previous prejudice to subtly give themselves to each other, never forcing a caress, but also never rejecting contact. They allowed things to follow their natural rhythm almost without realizing it. Thus, slowly the boundaries dissolved, leaving two beings fused by a deep bond of complicity, understanding and support beyond the physical. They had become each other's anchor, the shoulder to cry on, the word of encouragement, the support, and the one who pushed the other's steps when they lacked the strength to continue. They belonged to each other without conditions, without reproaches, without possessiveness, and, although they knew that harsh reality and the weight of a prejudiced society would eventually separate them sooner or later, as if that fortuitous encounter had been a perfect dream, they enjoyed each ephemeral but sublime moment of happiness that their united souls experienced in that bubble of anonymity, far from any external threat. Neither Gerardo nor Maria worried too much about the uncertain tomorrow. So intense was the need for each other and the complementarity of their personalities that pushed them to treasure each instant together as an invaluable treasure before fate forced them to continue on very likely different paths. At least, They would always keep the memory of those glorious days where they were so intensely happy and fulfilled. The sudden arrival of Camillo with alarming news completely surprised the small group, forcing them to quickly return to the harsh reality they had managed to keep at bay during their brief, amorous idyll in that remote cabin hidden among the mountains. After a moment of initial confusion, they quickly got into the vintage truck of the transporter, taking only the essentials, abandoning any item that could later link them to that place in case of a police raid. Although there was no indication yet that anyone was following their trail, it was better to err on the side of caution given the gravity of the information. So, in complete silence, to avoid drawing attention and almost not daring to breathe in the most exposed sections, our fugitives ventured further into the inhospitable mountainous area, heading to another cabin owned by a lumberjack friend of Camillo. They hoped that this even more remote and inaccessible place could give them the security and shelter they needed for at least a few weeks while they decided on the next steps. After an exhausting journey that felt eternal, navigating rough rural roads and trying to stay as unnoticed as possible during rare encounters with other vehicles or farmhouses, they finally arrived at their new refuge late at night. It was an old wooden house, greatly deteriorated by the relentless passage of time and the fury of the elements. At first glance, it was clear that their new lodging was far from offering the basic comforts for a long stay, but they trusted that at least it could provide them with a roof over their heads and, perhaps most importantly, anonymity away from prying eyes in this God-forsaken corner. Without hesitation or comments, they quickly settled in as discreetly as possible. Once inside, after a quick inspection of the dilapidated property, they confirmed that the house had indeed been abandoned for many years. Dirt and moisture reigned everywhere, with rotten or broken chairs and beds in poor condition due to leaks from the semi-destroyed roof. The presence of pests was also quite evident, as shown by a thick layer of dust, cobwebs, and accumulated droppings in the corners. But, doing everything possible not to collapse before such a depressing panorama, the trio decided to make the best of the scarce available resources. Thus, after improvising some lamps with greasy rags and lighting a fire in the fireplace, which fortunately worked, they managed to dispel part of the prevailing gloomy darkness. Camillo went out to the truck for a moment to bring some supplies and blankets they had packed in case they had to spend the night outdoors due to some unforeseen event during the journey. Fortunately, they still had some potable water they had brought along. So, after improvising some makeshift beds by putting together a couple of the least damaged beds in the less deteriorated room and mopping the floor a bit to make it somewhat walkable, the three exhausted fugitives finally felt somewhat settled. Huddled under an old blanket and more mentally than physically exhausted after the grueling journey dodging invisible dangers, Gerardo lay peacefully asleep on Maria's lap. She gently stroked his hair in an almost maternal gesture, watching over his dreams. Her features showed a hint of worry and uncertainty about what fate might hold in this tormenting scenario. Camillo looked at her in silence for a few moments before breaking the dense, almost ghostly silence that seemed to float over the eerie environment, barely lit by the dim light of the dying fireplace. "Don't torment yourself anymore, dear. You'll see that we'll get out of this somehow. You'll be safe here while we figure out all the details to travel quietly to the border. Meanwhile, I'll make sure to check how the investigation is progressing so we don't get caught again. But don't let the fear of the future stop you from enjoying the here and now," he said in a soft and calm voice as he took her hand in a comforting gesture. Maria gave him a deeply grateful look for his attempt to bring her some calm and encouragement. She knew his words were right. There was no point in tormenting herself, thinking about dangerous scenarios that hadn't yet manifested concretely. She needed to focus on making the most of these moments with her loved one and finding possible solutions to the difficult dilemma they faced. So, after a brief exchange of opinions regarding the next steps to take and finalizing some logistical details for the trip to the border to legalize new identities that Camilo would process with his contacts in the area, the night passed without major incident. In the distance, the mournful song of some nocturnal birds and the whisper of the wind among the treetops of the ancient weeping willows nearby could be heard, but nothing out of the ordinary in that region. At the break of dawn, the small group quickly prepared to leave those inhospitable lands. After gathering just a tiny bag with some clothes and filling the tank with reserve fuel to avoid refueling in potentially monitored areas, they set off in the same rickety truck they had arrived in the day before. They exchanged few words during the trip to the next city, with Camilo focusing on driving cautiously, alert to any suspicious movement, while Maria and Gerardo lay on the blankets in the truck bed like a pair of fugitives. They discreetly acquired 3 second-class tickets under another name, heading north under false identities. The plan was to try to cross the border through a nearby informal crossing and then seek refuge in the house of one of Camilo's distant aunts, while they finished legalizing new names and documentation for Maria and Gerardo before deciding on their final place of residence. The overland journey to the border was as exhausting as it was anxiety-inducing for the small group of outlaws. They remained mostly in absolute but alert silence, only exchanging the occasional furtive glance. Only Camilo got out during brief technical stops to stretch his legs and buy some fresh food, always alert to any strange element that might indicate the danger of pursuit. But fortunately, everything seemed in order. Finally, after nearly 2 days of constant jostling along winding rural routes filled with curves, potholes, and dizzying cliffs, a discreet picturesque sign announced their entrance to the small town of El Cobre. According to Camilo's estimations, they were now a mere 6 hours away from reaching their destination. After a quick pit stop to fuel up and stretch their legs, bolstered by a strong cup of joe to stave off the biting morning chill, they pressed on, civilization slowly revealing itself on the horizon. The signs of life hinted that they were edging closer to the first settled communities in the area. By noon, they finally pulled up at their intended stop. Camilo's elderly aunt's abode embodied the quintessential rustic charm of the countryside. Its sprawling facade boasted weathered red-tiled roofing and sturdy aged wooden beams supporting a generous front canopy. A majestic, ancient walnut tree stood sentinel beside the entrance, imparting a sense of heritage to the antique-filled interior. Welcoming them was the gracious elderly owner, her warm demeanor evident as she hurried to greet the noisy arrival of the battered truck along the dirt road. Despite her slightly faltering gait, a result of her numerous chronic ailments, she enveloped Camilo in a tight embrace, her joy unmistakable. Then, casting a kind glance towards the young couple who approached tentatively after the effusive welcome, she beckoned them inside with inviting words. "Come in, my dears. You'll find refuge here for as long as you need until you're ready to move on. It's a genuine pleasure to have you under my roof. Let's get you seated. I'll whip up a hearty roast to warm your weary bones after the long journey." Her words, delivered in a clear, folksy tone, infused the weary travelers with renewed hope. Maria and Gerardo shared a fleeting yet profound exchange, their eyes speaking volumes of gratitude, relief, and cautious optimism. They understood each other implicitly, no words necessary, their connection forged in the crucible of their harrowing journey. With the promise of a fresh start on the horizon, they dared to believe that the darkest night had finally given way to a new dawn.